The Georgia sun bore down on Whitmore Plantation like the eye of an angry god, watching everything, judging nothing. The cotton fields stretched endlessly in every direction, white bowls bursting from their shells like tiny screams frozen in time. Between the rows, dark bodies moved with the rhythm of survival. Bent backs, calloused hands, songs that carried pain disguised as praise. Ezekiel worked apart from the field hands, his domain the workshop near the main house. At 43 years old, he had spent 26 of them building things for Master Thomas Whitmore. His hands knew wood the way a preacher knows scripture. Every grain told a story, every knot revealed a weakness, every joint required respect. He built the veranda where the Whitmore family took their evening tea. He crafted the dining table where they discussed the price of human flesh over roasted duck. He constructed the four-poster bed where Master Thomas slept soundly while his property shivered in cabins, with gaps wide enough to let winter's teeth through. Tell me in the comments which country you are from and what you thought of this story. And if this story made an impression on you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss any future stories. The workshop smelled of pine shavings and sweat, turpentine and tobacco, tools hung in perfect rows on the wall, saws with teeth like Sunday smiles, hammers worn smooth by decades of impact, planes that could shave wood thin as paper. Everything had its place. Order was survival. Precision was protection. Ezekiel rarely spoke unless spoken to. His silence had become so complete that some of the younger slaves wondered if he'd been born mute. But Naomi knew different. She remembered when his voice carried across the quarters at night, telling stories of African kings and warriors who never bowed. She remembered his laugh, deep and genuine, before Whitmore purchased him from a Charleston auction block and systematically beat the sound out of him. Naomi was his wife of 18 years, a house slave who worked in the Whitmore kitchen from dawn until the last dish was dried and put away. She moved through the master's house like a shadow, visible only when needed, invisible when convenient. Her hands had prepared thousands of meals she'd never taste, polished silver she'd never use, washed sheets she'd never sleep on. She did this with the same quiet excellence that Ezekiel brought to his carpentry. Not out of love for the work, but out of love for each other. Every night they survived was a small victory. Every morning they woke together was an act of defiance against a system designed to break them. The Whitmore house stood 3 stories tall, white columns rising like accusations toward heaven. Master Thomas Whitmore inherited the plantation from his father, along with 147 human beings, and a philosophy that treated both equally as livestock. He was a man of moderate height and considerable girth, his face permanently flushed from whiskey and fury. At 52, he'd outlived 2 wives and fathered 7 children, 3 of whom survived past infancy. His current wife, Margaret, was 20 years his junior, a Charleston beauty whose smile never reached her eyes anymore. Their eldest son, Thomas Jr., was 19 and cruel in the casual way of young men raised to believe other people exist, only to serve them. He spent his days riding through the fields, occasionally whipping slaves whose work pace displeased him, then boasting about his management skills over dinner. His younger sister, Constance, was 16 and had developed the disturbing habit of watching the slaves with an expression that suggested she was trying to determine if they felt pain the same way her show horses did. On this particular Tuesday in August, 1842, Ezekiel was building a hope chest for Constance's upcoming 17th birthday. Master Thomas had commissioned it personally, describing in elaborate detail the brass hinges he wanted, the carved magnolia blossoms, the felt-lined interior. Ezekiel listened with his head bowed, his hands still, his mind cataloguing every specification. "I expect perfection, boy," Master Thomas said, standing too close, his breath sour with morning whiskey. "My daughter deserves the finest craftsmanship. That's why I keep you fed and housed, isn't it? so you can make beautiful things for beautiful people." "Yes, master," Ezekiel replied, his voice flat as hammered iron. "Look at me when I'm speaking to you." Ezekiel raised his eyes, careful to make his gaze respectful but not direct, present but not challenging. It was a calculation he'd perfected over decades, how to be visible enough to avoid punishment for insolence, while remaining invisible enough to avoid being seen as a threat. Master Thomas studied him for a long moment, searching for something to be offended by, some excuse to assert his authority. Finding nothing, he grunted and turned away. 2 weeks. I want it finished in 2 weeks. Yes, master." After the master left, Ezekiel stood motionless in the workshop, listening to the sounds of the plantation waking up fully, overseers shouting orders, children crying in the quarters, roosters announcing territory. His hands trembled slightly, and he pressed them flat against the workbench until they stilled. Control was everything. Emotion was dangerous. Anger was a luxury he couldn't afford. But that night, something happened that would make luxury a necessity. The Whitmore family was hosting dinner for the Beauregard family from the neighboring plantation. Naomi had spent all day helping prepare an elaborate meal: roasted duck, candied yams, collard greens seasoned with ham hock, buttermilk biscuits, peach cobbler. The dining room gleamed with silver and crystal, candles casting warm light across white faces flushed with wine and self-satisfaction. Naomi was clearing the soup course when it happened. Her hands, so steady for 18 years, so reliable and sure, somehow lost their grip. The crystal vase on the sideboard, filled with fresh-cut roses from Margaret Whitmore's garden, tipped, toppled, and shattered across the hardwood floor in an explosion of water, glass, and petals. The conversation stopped, as if someone had fired a gun. Margaret Whitmore rose slowly from her chair, her face contorted with rage. "You clumsy, worthless creature! That vase belonged to my grandmother." "It came from France." Naomi dropped to her knees immediately, hands scrambling to gather the pieces. "I'm sorry, mistress. I'm so sorry. Please, Sorry?" Margaret's voice climbed into hysteria. "Sorry doesn't restore what you've destroyed. Thomas, do something. She's ruined everything." Master Thomas stood, his napkin falling to the floor. The Beauregard family watched with the fascinated horror of spectators at a public execution. Thomas Jr. smiled. "Take her outside," Master Thomas said quietly. The quiet ones were always worse than the shouts. 2 house slaves, Marcus and John, stepped forward reluctantly. Their eyes met Naomi's with shared anguish as they took her arms. She didn't resist. Resistance made it worse. They led her to the back of the house where the whipping post stood, a permanent fixture of Whitmore discipline. Word spread quickly through the quarters. By the time they tied Naomi's wrists to the post and tore open the back of her dress, a crowd had gathered. Slaves forced to watch, masters ensuring the lesson landed. Ezekiel was finishing the dovetail joints on Constance's hope chest when he heard the first scream. His hands froze. The chisel slipped, cutting a thin line across his thumb. He barely noticed the blood. The second scream pulled him to his feet. By the third, he was running. He reached the yard as the overseer, Samuel Pritchard, brought the whip down for the 10th time. Naomi's back was a horror of torn flesh, blood streaming down to soak the waistband of her dress. Her screams had given way to low, animal sounds of agony. "Stop!" Ezekiel's voice cracked across the yard like thunder. Everyone turned. Master Thomas stood on the back porch, arms crossed, watching. Margaret beside him, satisfaction hardening her features. Thomas Jr. leaning against a column, bored now that the entertainment was winding down. Pritchard lowered the whip, looking to the master for instruction. "Please," Ezekiel said, forcing his voice steady. "Please, master. She didn't mean to. It was an accident. Please." Master Thomas descended the porch steps slowly. "Boy, you interrupting my discipline?" "No, master, because it sounds like you telling me what to do on my own property." "No, master. I would never. Maybe you need a reminder of your place too." "Please," Ezekiel whispered, all pride abandoned. "Please don't hurt her anymore." Master Thomas studied him with cold calculation. Then he smiled. All right, since you ask so nicely. Pritchard, 20 more. No! The word tore from Ezekiel's throat before he could stop it. 30! Ezekiel's legs nearly gave out. He watched, helpless, as Pritchard raised the whip again. Naomi turned her head, found his eyes across the distance. In that moment, he saw everything, her love, her forgiveness, her goodbye. The whip fell 30 more times. Naomi died before dawn, her body broken, infection racing through her bloodstream faster than any remedy could counter. Ezekiel held her in their cabin while she shivered and burned, her breath coming in shallow gasps. Other slaves came to sit with them, to pray, to witness. When her breathing finally stopped, Ezekiel continued holding her, rocking slowly, his eyes dry and distant. They buried her the next evening in the slave cemetery beyond the fields, wooden crosses marking countless graves of forgotten names. The preacher, old Moses, spoke about heaven and freedom and Jesus' love. The other slaves sang spirituals that disguised rage as worship. Ezekiel didn't sing. He stood with dirt on his hands from filling her grave, staring at nothing, saying nothing. But inside, in the place where his voice used to live, something new was taking shape. That night he returned to his workshop. The moon cast silver light through the windows, illuminating his tools on the wall. He ran his fingers along the handles, hammer, saw, plane, chisel, each one familiar as his own heartbeat. Master Thomas wanted Constance's hope chest finished in 2 weeks. Ezekiel would give him something better. He would give him perfection. The morning after Naomi's burial, Ezekiel reported to the workshop before sunrise. Other slaves noticed the change in him immediately, not in his demeanor, which remained as silent and controlled as always, but in his eyes. Something had gone cold behind them, frozen over like a pond in January. When they greeted him, he nodded but didn't speak. When they offered condolences, he accepted them with a slight inclination of his head and nothing more. Master Thomas appeared mid-morning, thumbs hooked in his vest, satisfaction radiating from his pores like cheap cologne. He'd made his point. He'd reasserted his dominance. In his mind, the matter was settled. "Ezekiel," he said, voice almost jovial, "how's that hope chest coming along?" "Well, master," Ezekiel replied, not looking up from the wood he was sanding, "should be finished on time." "Good, good. Excellence, boy. I expect excellence." He paused, waiting for a response. When none came, he added, "I'm sorry about your woman, but you understand discipline's necessary. Can't have slaves breaking valuable things without consequences. Other niggers would get ideas." Ezekiel's hands stilled for just a moment, then resumed their rhythmic motion against the wood. "Yes, master. You're a smart boy. You understand." "Yes, master." Master Thomas lingered, vaguely unsatisfied by the interaction, but unable to identify why. Finally he turned and left, boots heavy on the workshop floor. Alone again, Ezekiel set down the sandpaper. His hands were completely steady. He walked to the window and looked out across the plantation, cotton fields stretching toward horizons that meant nothing to the people forced to work them, the big house gleaming white and proud, the quarters dark and cramped, everything exactly as it had been yesterday and the day before and the year before, except Naomi wasn't in it anymore. He returned to work with mechanical precision, his movements economical and exact. The hope chest took shape under his hands, dovetail joints fitting together with seamless perfection, the carved magnolia blossoms emerging from solid wood, like trapped spirits finally released, brass hinges positioned exactly where they'd provide maximum support. It was, objectively, the finest piece he'd ever created. He finished it in 10 days. When Master Thomas inspected it, running his thick fingers across the smooth surfaces, testing the hinges, admiring the craftsmanship, he actually smiled. "Now this is what I'm talking about. This is why I keep you around, boy. You got a gift." "Thank you, Master." "Margaret, come see what the carpenter made for Constance." Margaret Whitmore swept into the workshop, her skirts rustling with expensive fabric. She circled the hope chest slowly, examining it from every angle. "It's beautiful," she admitted grudgingly. "Really quite beautiful." "Told you he was worth keeping fed," Master Thomas said, pride in his property evident in his voice. After they left, discussing where to position the chest in Constance's bedroom, Ezekiel stood alone in his workshop. Through the window, he could see Thomas Jr. riding his horse through the fields, shouting at slaves whose work pace displeased him. He could see the overseer Pritchard walking the property line with his whip coiled at his belt. He could see the life he'd lived for 26 years, continuing exactly as it always had. That evening, Master Thomas summoned him to the main house. Ezekiel climbed the back steps and entered through the kitchen, where 3 house slaves were preparing dinner. They looked at him with sympathy and something else. Caution, maybe, or fear. He'd become unpredictable in his grief, and unpredictability was dangerous. In the parlor, Master Thomas sat in a leather chair, glass of whiskey in hand. "Ezekiel, I got another job for you." "Yes, Master." "My carriage is falling apart. Axles cracked, frames weakened, wheels wobbling. Been meaning to get it fixed for months now. I want you to rebuild it, not just repair. Rebuild, make it strong enough to last another 20 years. Can you do that?" Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. "Yes, Master. I can do that." "Good. How long you need?" 3 weeks, maybe 4, depending on how bad the damage is." "Take 4 then. Do it right." Master Thomas leaned forward. "This carriage matters, you understand. It's how I present myself to the county. I ride into Savannah in a broken-down wagon. People think I'm losing my grip. I ride in something magnificent. They remember why the Whitmores matter. You understand?" "Yes, Master." "Excellence, boy. Same as that hope chest. I want excellence." "You'll have it, Master." The carriage sat in the barn, covered with dust and neglect. It was a statement piece, black lacquered wood, brass fixtures, red velvet interior. Built 15 years ago by a master craftsman in Charleston, it had cost Master Thomas more than he'd paid for 20 slaves. But time and use had taken their toll. The axle was indeed cracked, the frame warped from years of supporting Thomas Whitmore's considerable weight, wheels showing stress fractures around the spokes. Ezekiel spent 2 days just examining it, measuring every component, testing every joint. He borrowed slate and chalk from the plantation schoolhouse, where white children learned to read while slave children learned to pick cotton, and drew detailed diagrams. Other slaves would see him late at night, sitting in the barn by lamplight, staring at his drawings with an intensity that made them uncomfortable. Old Moses, the plantation preacher, approached him one evening. Moses was 73, had been enslaved for 62 years, wore his white hair like a crown, and his scars like scripture. "You all right, son?" Moses asked gently, settling onto a stool beside Ezekiel's workbench. "Fine." "Don't look fine. Look like a man at war with himself." Ezekiel didn't respond, just continued measuring the carriage's wheel circumference. "I knew Naomi since she was a girl," Moses continued. "Sweet spirit, kind heart. Didn't deserve what happened to her." He paused. "None of us deserve what happens to us." "No," Ezekiel agreed quietly. "We don't. But we endure, we survive. We keep faith that judgment coming even if we don't live to see it." Judgment. Ezekiel set down his measuring tape. "Moses, how long you been waiting on judgment?" "Long time." "How long we supposed to wait while they kill us, while they beat us, while they work us to death and rape our women and sell our children?" His voice remained low, controlled, but something fierce burned beneath it. "How much longer, Moses?" The old man was quiet for a long while. Finally he said, "I don't know, son. I truly don't. But I know vengeance belongs to the Lord." "Maybe," Ezekiel replied, returning to his work. "Maybe the Lord needs better hands to work with." Moses left without another word. Over the next 3 weeks, Ezekiel dismantled the carriage completely. He removed every bolt, every screw, every piece of hardware. He laid everything out in organized rows on the barn floor, like a surgeon preparing for a complex operation. The other slaves who worked nearby, tending horses, mucking stalls, repairing tack, watched him work with growing fascination. He was rebuilding more than a carriage. He was building a message. The replacement axle took a week to forge, working with Benjamin, the plantation blacksmith. Benjamin was massive, his muscles built from years at the anvil, his hands scarred from burns that had long since stopped hurting. He spoke even less than Ezekiel, his silence enforced by a childhood trauma that left him mute. But his eyes were sharp, and he understood things without words. When Ezekiel explained what he needed, the measurements, the weight capacity, the stress points, Benjamin nodded slowly. They worked together in the forge, sweat streaming down their backs in the oppressive Georgia heat, hammer striking anvil in rhythmic precision. Benjamin shaped the metal while Ezekiel watched, occasionally adjusting the angle or indicating where more work was needed. On the 3rd day of forging, Benjamin paused in his hammering. He looked at Ezekiel, then at the axle, taking shape on his anvil, then back at Ezekiel. His eyes asked a question he couldn't voice. Ezekiel met his gaze steadily. "Sometimes things need to break," he said quietly, "so better things can be built." Benjamin held his eyes for a long moment. Then he nodded and returned to his work, understanding settling between them like an oath. The frame reconstruction took another week. Ezekiel worked from dawn until dark, occasionally through the night, obsessed with precision. He replaced rotted wood with fresh lumber, choosing pieces that looked strong but contained hidden weaknesses, knots positioned exactly where stress would concentrate, grain running against structural integrity in ways invisible to untrained eyes, joints that appeared solid but were calculated to fail under specific conditions. Other slaves began to notice the intensity of his focus. Sarah, who worked in the barn tending Master Thomas's horses, brought him water one afternoon. "You ain't eating enough," she observed, watching him work. "You getting too thin." "I'm fine." "That's what you keep saying. But you ain't fine. Not since—" She stopped, swallowed. "Not since we lost Naomi." Ezekiel's hands paused briefly on the wood he was shaping. "She didn't get lost, Sarah. She got killed. I know that. We all know that." Sarah set the water bucket down heavily. "And we all angry about it, but anger don't change nothing. It just burn you up inside until there ain't nothing left." "Maybe some fires need to burn." Sarah studied him carefully. "What you planning, Ezekiel?" "Planning to finish this carriage, that's all." "Don't lie to me. I see it in your eyes. You planning something." He finally looked at her directly. "You want to know what I'm planning? I'm planning to do exactly what Master Thomas told me to do. Build him a carriage worthy of his station. Give him exactly what he deserves." The words hung in the air between them, heavy with implications. Sarah backed away slowly. Just be careful. Please. We already lost Naomi. Can't lose you too." "Don't worry about me," Ezekiel replied, returning to his work. "Worry about being somewhere else when that carriage goes riding." She left quickly after that, and Ezekiel knew she'd spread word through the quarters. Good. They needed to know. They needed to understand what was coming. By the 4th week, the carriage was nearly complete. The new axle gleamed with fresh paint. The frame looked solid and strong. The wheels rolled smoothly. The brass fixtures shone. The red velvet interior had been cleaned and restored. To any observer, it appeared to be the finest work Ezekiel had ever done. Perhaps the finest work any carpenter in Georgia had ever done. But Ezekiel knew the truth, hidden in the joints and grain and measurements. He knew exactly how long it would hold. Master Thomas inspected it on Saturday afternoon, running his hands over the surfaces, testing the suspension, admiring his reflection in the polished brass. "Outstanding," he declared. "Absolutely outstanding. Better than it was brand new. You outdid yourself, boy." "Thank you, Master. We're taking it to church tomorrow." The whole family. Let everyone in the county see what Whitmore craftsmanship looks like. He smiled, pleased with himself, pleased with his property, pleased with a world that bent to accommodate his whims. You did good, Ezekiel. Real good. Just gave you what you deserve, master. Ezekiel replied quietly. That night, alone in his cabin, Ezekiel sat in the darkness and thought about Naomi. He remembered her laugh, her hands, the way she hummed while working, the strength in her voice when she whispered that she loved him. He remembered the sound of the whip. He remembered her final breath. He remembered everything. And when morning came, he would make sure Master Thomas Whitmore remembered too. Sunday morning arrived with deceptive beauty. The Georgia sky stretched cloudless and blue, mockingbirds celebrated in the magnolia trees, and the plantation bell rang, calling slaves to their weekly chapel service. The Whitmore family prepared for their own worship at the First Baptist Church in Fairfield, 8 miles away, a journey that would showcase the Master's newly restored carriage to everyone they passed. Ezekiel watched from his workshop as the family emerged from the main house in their Sunday finest. Master Thomas wore his best black suit, gold watch chain glinting across his substantial belly. Margaret's dress was pale blue silk, with enough fabric to clothe 6 slave children. Thomas Jr. looked bored and arrogant in equal measure, already anticipating the tedium of his father's friends discussing cotton prices and politics. Constance clutched her Bible with white-gloved hands, the very picture of Southern innocence. Samuel Pritchard, the overseer, would drive them. He climbed onto the driver's seat, leather reins in hand, his face sunburned and mean. The same hands that held those reins had wielded the whip that killed Naomi. Ezekiel felt nothing watching him. No rage, no hatred, no satisfaction, just a carpenter's cold certainty that he'd built something exactly to specifications. Master Thomas approached Ezekiel one final time. "You sure this carriage is sound?" "Yes, master. Tested everything twice." "Good, good." He clapped Ezekiel on the shoulder with the casual affection men show their dogs. "You keep up this quality work. Might think about getting you a new woman. Can't have a craftsman like you without proper tending." But the words landed like stones in still water. Ezekiel watched the ripples spread through his consciousness, the suggestion that Naomi was replaceable, that love was fungible, that human beings were interchangeable commodities to be distributed at a master's whim. "That's generous, master," he replied, voice flat as hammered tin. "Thought you'd appreciate it. Now you have a blessed Sunday." Master Thomas climbed into the carriage, the suspension creaking under his weight in a way that would have alarmed a more careful man. Ezekiel stood motionless as Pritchard snapped the reins. The horses, 2 matched bays named Caesar and Brutus, stepped forward smoothly. The carriage wheels began to turn, brass fixtures catching sunlight, the whole contraption looking like something from a dream of gentility and grace. It rolled down the long drive toward the main road, past the cotton fields, where 200 slaves would spend their Sunday afternoon picking, despite the Lord's supposed day of rest. Past the quarters where children played in the dirt, because childhood was a luxury measured in stolen moments. Past the graveyard where fresh earth still marked Naomi's resting place. Other slaves had gathered to watch, word having spread that something significant might happen. Old Moses stood with his hat in his hands. Sarah kept her eyes fixed on the departing carriage. Benjamin the blacksmith leaned against the forge, his massive arms crossed, his face unreadable. They didn't know exactly what Ezekiel had done, but they understood in the way people understand thunder before rain, instinct, intuition, the electricity of impending change. The carriage reached the end of the drive and turned onto the county road. 1/2 mile to Judgment. Ezekiel had calculated it precisely, far enough from the plantation that the Whitmores would feel safe, close enough that everyone would hear what happened next. He watched until the carriage disappeared around a bend, swallowed by pine trees and morning shadows. Then he turned and walked toward his cabin, his steps measured and calm. Behind him, he heard old Moses start to pray. The carriage rolled smoothly for the first 1/4 mile. Inside, the Whitmore family settled into comfortable silence. Master Thomas gazed out at his land with proprietary satisfaction. Margaret adjusted her hat. Thomas Jr. picked at his fingernails. Constance read scripture, lips moving silently through psalms. "This is quite comfortable," Margaret observed. "Much better than before." "Told you that Carpenter was worth his salt," Master Thomas replied. "Best investment I ever made, buying him off that Charleston block. Man's got genuine talent." "Can talent be genuine if it's forced?" Constance asked suddenly. Her parents turned to stare at her. "What kind of question is that?" Master Thomas demanded. "I just wondered," Constance said, eyes still on her Bible. "If we force someone to build things, can we really call it their gift, or is it just compliance?" "Good Lord," Thomas Jr. muttered. "Not this again." "That's enough of that kind of thinking," Master Thomas said firmly. "Your bleeding heart does you no credit, daughter. The Negro has a natural inclination toward labor and service. We're giving them purpose, structure. They'd be lost without us." Constance returned to her Bible without responding, but something flickered across her face. Doubt, perhaps, or disgust. The carriage rolled on. At the half-mile mark, the road dipped through a small valley where a creek ran during wet seasons. Currently dry, it created a depression in the road surface, a natural point of stress. The carriage descended into the dip at moderate speed. The first sound was subtle, a crack like a branch breaking underfoot. Master Thomas frowned. "What was—" The second crack was louder, definitive, final. The axle weakened precisely where stress would concentrate, where Ezekiel had calculated forces would exceed tolerance, where metal would remember the forge and decide to return to formlessness. It snapped. The carriage lurched violently. The frame, its joints compromised in ways invisible to inspection but catastrophic under load, began to collapse. Wheels splayed outward. The suspension gave way. In the space between one heartbeat and the next, a vehicle that had appeared solid and safe became a cage of failing components. Margaret Whitmore screamed. The carriage tilted, rolled, crashed onto its side with a sound like the world breaking. The horses, still attached to the wreckage, bolted in panic. They dragged the disintegrating carriage 30 yards before Pritchard managed to cut them free, his own body thrown clear in the initial collapse. Inside the wreckage, the Whitmore family lay tangled and broken. Master Thomas had been crushed beneath the frame's collapse, his substantial weight working against him as physics and geometry conspired toward fatal conclusion. The gold watch chain he'd worn so proudly was now embedded in shattered wood, its face frozen at 7 minutes past 9. Margaret lived long enough to call for help, her voice weak with pain and shock. Her leg was shattered, bone protruding through silk. She would survive, but she would never walk properly again. Thomas Jr. had been thrown partially clear, his head striking a rock with force sufficient to leave him unconscious but alive. He would wake hours later with no memory of the accident and a permanently impaired ability to recognize faces. Constance, smallest and positioned nearest the window, had been thrown completely free during the initial roll. She landed hard, shoulder dislocated, ribs cracked but fundamentally intact. She lay in the dust, staring at the blue sky, her Bible 10 feet away, open to Exodus. "You shall not oppress a stranger, for you know the heart of a stranger, seeing you were strangers in the land of Egypt." Pritchard, bleeding from a gash on his forehead, ran for help. His boots pounded the dirt road back toward Whitmore Plantation, his voice cracking as he screamed for assistance. At the plantation, slaves heard the shouting before they understood the words. They emerged from fields and quarters, from barn and workshop, from every corner of the property. The news spread like fire in dry grass. The carriage had collapsed, the master was dead, the family was destroyed. Old Moses closed his eyes and whispered thanks to a God who'd finally answered one prayer. Sarah covered her mouth with both hands, torn between horror and relief. Benjamin the blacksmith stood perfectly still, his face revealing nothing, his heart pounding with something that might have been satisfaction, or might have been fear, or might have been both. And Ezekiel, sitting in his cabin with his few possessions already packed in a canvas bag, listened to the chaos rising around him and felt absolutely nothing. Not joy, not guilt, not grief. Just the empty space where those feelings used to live, now occupied by the cold certainty that justice, however imperfect, had been served. He stood, picked up his bag, and walked to his workshop one final time. On the workbench sat the unfinished coffin he'd been building for weeks. He'd started it the day after Naomi died, working on it in stolen moments when no one was watching. It was simple but solid, pine wood smoothed and ready for stain. Using a small chisel, he carved 2 words into the inside of the lid: Ezekiel Freeman. Not his slave name, not Whitmore's property, his own name claimed and declared. Then he walked away from Whitmore Plantation, his shadow long in the morning sun, following back roads and deer paths known to those who moved through Georgia's margins. He carried nothing that could identify him, nothing that could track him, nothing but his tools and his hands and the knowledge that he'd built one final thing for Master Thomas Whitmore: an ending. Behind him, the plantation descended into chaos. Overseers ran toward the accident site. House slaves tended to the injured. Field slaves stood frozen in the rows, uncertain whether to work or wait, whether to mourn or celebrate, whether this moment meant anything would actually change. Constance Whitmore, being loaded onto a makeshift stretcher by 2 male slaves, looked back down the road toward the plantation. Through the pine trees and distance, she thought she saw a figure walking away, tall, deliberate, carrying something over his shoulder. Gone before she could be certain it wasn't just shadow and imagination. Years later, she would wonder if she'd actually seen him. Years later, after inheriting the plantation and gradually, painfully, beginning the process of freeing its slaves, she would think about that figure walking away and understand that some people free themselves rather than wait for freedom to be granted. But that morning, lying broken in the Georgia dust, she simply closed her eyes and wondered if God's justice always required such violence, or if this was just the inevitable physics of systems built on suffering. The carriage, meanwhile, lay in ruins. Brass fixtures bent, velvet torn, lacquered wood splintered into sharp fragments. An accident, the authorities would declare. Tragic, but not suspicious. Equipment failure. These things happen. Only one person knew different, and he was already 10 miles gone, building distance with the same careful precision he'd brought to every joint, every measurement, every perfectly compromised component of a master's final ride. The investigation into Master Thomas Whitmore's death lasted 3 days and concluded exactly as Ezekiel knew it would. Accidental death due to equipment failure, no negligence, no malice, just the tragic confluence of age, weight, and weakened wood. The county sheriff, a man named Dalton, who owed the Whitmore family multiple favors, conducted a perfunctory examination of the wreckage and found nothing suspicious. Carriage was old, he announced to the assembled white men of Fairfield. Wood rots, metal fatigues, accidents happen. No one questioned the timing. No one wondered why a recently rebuilt carriage would fail so catastrophically. No one interviewed the carpenter who'd done the work, because Negro testimony held no weight in Georgia courts. And besides, the carpenter had disappeared. The slave quarters buzzed with whispered conversations that stopped whenever white people approached. Everyone knew something significant had occurred, but no one spoke it aloud. Speaking truth to power was suicidal. Speaking truth to each other was dangerous. So they spoke in coded songs and meaningful silences, in the language of people who'd learned to communicate in chains. Old Moses preached Naomi's funeral sermon at the regular Sunday service, though she'd been buried 10 days prior. "The Lord works in mysterious ways," he told the gathered slaves, his voice carrying layers of meaning. "He sees suffering, he knows injustice, and in his time, not ours, he brings judgment. We might not understand his methods. We might not recognize his instruments, but we trust his righteousness." The white overseer in attendance, a young man named Patterson, who'd replaced Pritchard after the accident left him too traumatized to continue, understood nothing of the sermon's subtext. He heard religion and nodded approvingly. The slaves heard vindication. Margaret Whitmore survived, but was forever changed. Her shattered leg never healed properly, despite the best doctors Charleston could provide. She moved through the house with a cane, her beauty calcified into bitterness, her voice sharp with pain and laudanum. She sold 30 slaves within the first month, claiming financial necessity but really just needing to hurt something in retaliation for her hurt. Thomas Jr. recovered physically but not mentally. The head trauma left him with scattered memories and a volatile temper. He wandered the plantation grounds talking to himself, occasionally explosive with rage, frequently weeping for reasons he couldn't articulate. Within a year, Margaret would have him committed to an asylum in Milledgeville, where he'd spend his remaining days painting watercolors of carriages and crying. Only Constance emerged relatively intact, though her recovery was spiritual rather than merely physical. The dislocated shoulder healed, the cracked ribs mended. But something in her had been permanently altered by the sight of her father, crushed beneath his own arrogance, her mother screaming, her brother unconscious, all of them brought low by wood and metal and physics. She began reading books her father would have burned. Abolitionist literature smuggled from the North, theological arguments against slavery, first-hand accounts from formerly enslaved people. She attended secret meetings with other white Southerners who'd developed doubts about the peculiar institution. She started, in small ways, to resist. It would be years before she inherited the plantation and could act on her convictions. But the seed was planted that Sunday morning in the Georgia dust, germinating in her fractured bones and traumatized conscience. Meanwhile, Ezekiel moved through Georgia like water finding downward paths. He avoided main roads, traveled at night, worked odd carpentry jobs for cash in small towns where no one asked questions. His hands remained steady, his face remained calm, but something fundamental had shifted in his bearing. He no longer moved with the defensive posture of enslaved people, eyes down, shoulders slightly rounded, taking up as little space as possible. He walked upright now, met people's eyes, spoke when spoken to, but didn't volunteer deference. Some white people noticed and bristled with instinctive hostility. Others, particularly poor whites, who'd never owned slaves and resented the aristocracy that did, recognized something kindred in his quiet defiance and left him alone. He crossed into South Carolina 3 weeks after leaving Whitmore Plantation. The border was just a river, but crossing it felt like resurrection. Georgia contained Naomi's grave, her memory, the violence that killed her. South Carolina was simply geography, neutral, clean, empty of history. In a town called Edgefield, he found work at a freedmen's settlement. These were rare enclaves where previously enslaved people had purchased their freedom or been manumitted by guilt-stricken masters, pooling resources to buy land and build lives. The settlement consisted of maybe 40 families farming a few hundred acres, supporting themselves through agriculture and skilled trades. They needed a carpenter desperately. Their meeting house had a rotting roof. Homes required repairs. Children needed school benches. The settlement leader, a man named Isaiah, who'd bought his freedom 15 years prior after his master died interstate, interviewed Ezekiel cautiously. "You got papers?" Isaiah asked. "No. That's going to be a problem. Patrols come through, they'll assume you're runaway property." "I am runaway property." Isaiah studied him carefully. "That honesty's going to get you caught." "Rather get caught being honest than survive being something I'm not." Something in Isaiah's weathered face softened. "What's your name?" Ezekiel Freeman. Freeman's a bold name for a man still technically enslaved. It's the only name that fits anymore. Isaiah was quiet for a long moment. Then he nodded. All right, Ezekiel Freeman. You can stay, but you work for the community, not for wages. We don't have money. We have food, shelter, and freedom. That enough? That's everything. Ezekiel stayed at the settlement for 6 months. He rebuilt the meeting house roof, working alongside men whose hands knew labor but not carpentry. He taught them joinery techniques, how to read wood grain, how to calculate load-bearing requirements. He built school benches, a well cover, storage sheds. He measured twice and cut once, and took satisfaction in work done for people who valued it rather than demanded it. The settlement children were fascinated by him. They'd crowd around his workspace asking questions, touching his tools, begging for stories. He was patient with them in ways he'd never been able to be at Whitmore Plantation, where black children were property before they were people, valued for future labor rather than present humanity. One evening, a girl named Clara, maybe 7 years old with ribbons in her hair and questions in her eyes, asked him, "Where you come from, Mr. Ezekiel?" "Georgia," he replied, planing a board smooth. "Why you leave?" The adults nearby tensed, sensing dangerous territory. Ezekiel paused his work and looked at Clara directly. "Because sometimes you have to walk away from places that want to kill you." "Was someone trying to kill you?" "Yes." "Did you kill them back?" The adults moved to intervene, but Ezekiel raised a hand, stopping them. He set down his plane and knelt to Clara's level. "I didn't kill anyone, but I stopped letting them kill me. Sometimes that's the same thing." Clara considered this seriously. "My daddy says we got to forgive people who hurt us. Your daddy's a wise man. Forgiveness is important." Ezekiel paused. "But so is justice, and sometimes you can't have one without the other." He returned to his work, and Clara wandered off to play, and the adults exchanged looks that contained multitudes: understanding, approval, caution, respect. Isaiah approached later that night while Ezekiel was sharpening his tools. "You're a dangerous man," he observed, settling onto a stool. "Why do you say that?" "Because you're not afraid anymore. Fear keeps us alive, keeps us careful. But you've moved past fear into something else." "And what's that?" "Purpose." Isaiah lit a pipe, the tobacco smell mixing with pine shavings. "Man with purpose is harder to control than a man with fear." "You afraid of me?" "No, but I'm afraid for you. That kind of purpose gets people killed." Ezekiel tested the plane's blade against his thumb, feeling the edge. "We're all going to die eventually. Question is whether we die as ourselves or as what they made us." Heavy philosophy for a Sunday night. Learned it from heavy experience. They sat in comfortable silence for a while, two men who understood suffering without needing to catalogue its details. Finally, Isaiah said, "There's rumors about a master getting killed in a carriage accident. Thomas Whitmore, Fairfield, Georgia. You know anything about that?" Ezekiel's hands stilled briefly, then continued sharpening. "I know Master Thomas Whitmore is dead. And the world's better for it. Did you?" "I'm a carpenter, Isaiah. I build things. Sometimes I build things that last. Sometimes I build things that don't. What happens after I've finished my work isn't really my concern anymore." Isaiah absorbed this, reading between every carefully chosen word. "They're looking for you. Might not know your name, but they're asking questions, talking about investigating that accident more thoroughly. Someone got suspicious. Someone always gets suspicious. You need to move on, soon." "I figured." "Where will you go?" Ezekiel was quiet for a long time, staring at nothing, seeing everything. Finally, he said, "North, eventually, but there's work to do first." "What kind of work?" "Same kind I've always done, building things, fixing things. Making sure structures can hold what they're meant to hold and fail when they're meant to fail." Isaiah didn't press for clarification. Some things were better not spoken aloud. Ezekiel left the settlement 2 days later, supplies packed, tools wrapped carefully in canvas. The community gave him smoked meat, cornbread, a blanket, a letter testifying to his good character that he'd probably never be able to use. Clara gave him a carved wooden bird she'd tried to make, its wings crooked but its intention perfect. "So you remember to fly away when danger comes," she explained seriously. He thanked her gravely and promised to keep it always. He walked north, following the Savannah River toward the Carolinas' interior. Word had spread through the underground networks of communication that connected enslaved and free black communities, networks built on trust and coded language and the shared understanding that information meant survival. They said a white man in Columbia was looking for a skilled carpenter, said he paid fair wages and didn't ask about papers, said he needed someone to build a school for Negro children, a project that required someone willing to work at the margins of social acceptability. Ezekiel arrived in Columbia on a Tuesday afternoon, found the man's address, knocked on his door. The white man who answered, elderly, kind-faced, obviously Quaker, studied him carefully. "You're the carpenter?" "Yes, sir." "What's your name?" "Ezekiel Freeman." "Freeman." The man smiled slightly. "Aspirational?" "Factual." "I like you already. Come in." The school project took 4 months. Ezekiel designed a simple but sturdy structure that could accommodate 30 students. Built-in benches, a teacher's desk, windows positioned for maximum natural light. He worked with 2 freedmen from the local community, teaching them carpentry as they built, transforming labor into education. White neighbors complained. The city council debated shutting it down. Anonymous threats appeared pinned to trees near the construction site. But the Quaker man, his name was Samuel Pritchard, coincidentally sharing a surname with Whitmore's deceased overseer, had enough money and social capital to keep the project moving forward. "Why do you do this?" Ezekiel asked him one day while they reviewed plans. "Do what?" "Risk your reputation, your safety, everything you have, for people you don't know." Samuel was quiet for a moment. "Because God doesn't make mistakes, but humans make them constantly. Slavery is humanity's mistake, not God's intention. Some of us have to work to correct it, or we're complicit in perpetuating it. Most white people don't see it that way. Most white people profit from not seeing it that way. Difficult to convince a man of moral truth when his income depends on moral blindness." Ezekiel almost smiled. "You're unusual. So are you. Free man walking around slave territory, using a name that's essentially a legal impossibility. Building things for communities the law says don't deserve education. We're both unusual. Maybe that's why we work well together." The school opened in spring of 1843, 11 months after Naomi's death. 30 Negro children attended the first day, dressed in their best clothes, carrying slates and primers, their faces bright with the possibility of literacy. Ezekiel stood in the back of the room during opening ceremonies, watching. Samuel Pritchard gave a speech about justice and education and hope. The teacher, a freed woman named Harriet, who taught herself to read using stolen newspapers, led the children in a hymn, and Ezekiel thought about Naomi, about how she'd never learned to read, how Master Thomas kept his slaves illiterate intentionally, how knowledge was hoarded by those with power to prevent those without power from challenging the arrangement. He thought about the carriage, about precision and physics, and the cold satisfaction of building something to exact specifications. And he thought about the future, not his future specifically, but the larger future of people who looked like him, who suffered like him, who deserved better than a world built on their backs while denying them any foundation to stand on. After the ceremony, he walked to the front of the classroom. Harriet looked up, smiling. "Can I help you?" "I wondered if you could teach me," he said quietly. "To read and write." Her smile widened. "I'd be honored." So Ezekiel stayed in Columbia. He took on more carpentry projects, homes for freedmen, repairs for sympathetic white families, structures that would outlast the era that built them. And 3 evenings a week, he sat at a child's desk in the school he'd built, learning letters, then words, then sentences, then ideas. It was slow. His hands, so skilled with tools, fumbled with pencils. His mind, so precise with measurements, struggled with spelling. But he persisted with the same methodical determination he brought to carpentry, understanding that both were forms of construction. One built physical structures, the other built the foundation for thinking beyond the structures imposed by others. 2 years later, he could read newspapers. 3 years later, he could write letters. 4 years later, he could read books. Frederick Douglass's autobiography, Harriet Beecher Stowe's protests, philosophical treatises about human rights and natural law. And slowly, quietly, he began to understand that what he'd done to Thomas Whitmore wasn't just vengeance. It was a form of resistance, a declaration that enslaved people weren't passive victims waiting for abolition, but active participants in their own liberation. He wondered sometimes if he'd made the right choice, if violence, even violence disguised as accident, was justified, if he'd become the thing he hated by using death as a tool. But then he'd visit the school and see children learning, or walk through the freedman settlement and see families building lives, or read about slave rebellions and underground railroad rescues. And he'd understand that resistance took many forms. Some people resisted by teaching, some by harboring runaways, some by organizing politically. And some, like him, resisted by building things carefully designed to collapse at exactly the right moment. By 1847, Ezekiel had built 17 structures across the Carolinas and Georgia: schools, churches, community centers, homes. Each one stood solid and true, built with the precision that defined his work. He'd become known in certain circles as a master carpenter who worked for reasonable rates and didn't discriminate based on skin color. White Quakers hired him. Free black communities sought him out. Even some moderate-minded slaveholders employed him, appreciating quality craftsmanship more than they resented its source. He'd also built himself into someone new, not the silent, subservient slave who existed at Whitmore Plantation. Not even the vengeful ghost who walked away from a master's crushed body, but something more complete, a man who read philosophy, debated theology, understood that justice existed in gradations rather than absolutes. He was 48 now, his hands still steady, but his back sometimes aching from years of labor. Gray threaded through his hair. Scars from decades of slavery marked his body like a map of suffering. But his eyes remained clear and purposeful. He'd never remarried, never even considered it. Naomi existed in his heart as something complete, not needing replacement or addition. Other women had expressed interest over the years. Sarah from Whitmore Plantation had tracked him down once, suggesting they could build something new together. He declined gently, explaining that his heart was occupied by memory and his hands were occupied by work that demanded complete focus. During these years, the nation was tearing itself apart over slavery. The Mexican-American War had raised questions about whether new territories would be slave or free. The Compromise of 1850 tried to balance interests that couldn't be balanced. Violence erupted in Kansas between pro-slavery and anti-slavery settlers. Political debates became physical confrontations. The country was pregnant with war, the contractions getting closer together. Ezekiel followed these developments through newspapers, through conversations in freedmen communities, through letters from abolitionists who'd heard about his work and wanted to support it. He understood that individual acts of resistance, like collapsing a carriage, meant little against the systemic violence of slavery. But he also understood that systems were built from individual components, and enough compromised components could bring down structures that appeared permanent. In the spring of 1851, Samuel Pritchard died. He was 83, had spent 50 years fighting slavery through peaceful means, and passed quietly in his sleep. Ezekiel attended the funeral, one of only 3 black men permitted inside the white church. He listened to eulogies praising Samuel's courage and conviction, watched white mourners cry for a man who'd challenged their world, and understood that change happened because individual humans chose conscience over convenience. Samuel left Ezekiel $300 in his will, an enormous sum. The white executor delivered it with obvious reluctance, making Ezekiel sign 3 separate documents and warning him that carrying such money would make him a target. Ezekiel used it to buy a small plot of land outside Columbia, 2 acres with good timber and access to a creek. He built a workshop there, larger than anything he'd had before, properly equipped with tools he'd purchased rather than borrowed. He built a small house, just 3 rooms, efficient and comfortable. And he built a chapel open to anyone regardless of race or legal status, the local authorities noticed. A black man owning property raised questions about social order. They investigated his background, trying to find proof he was escaped property rather than legitimately free. They questioned neighbors, they examined documents, but Ezekiel had been careful. He had letters of reference from Samuel Pritchard and other respected white citizens. He had bills of sale for his tools and materials. He maintained meticulous records of his work and income, and most importantly, he'd been free long enough that his original owner was dead and the plantation's records had been lost in a fire that might or might not have been accidental. Georgia had wanted him for questioning after Thomas Whitmore's death, but that investigation had gone cold years ago. Without proof, without witnesses, without evidence beyond suspicious timing, they'd eventually concluded what Ezekiel knew they'd conclude: equipment failure, tragic accident, no one to blame. So he existed in legal limbo, not quite free in the eyes of a society that assumed black skin meant enslaved status, but not provably enslaved in a system that required documentation to claim ownership. It was precarious. But then, everything about being black in America in 1851 was precarious. He was in his workshop one afternoon, building pews for the chapel, when 3 men approached, 2 white, 1 black. They moved with purpose, but not hostility, suggesting they'd come to talk rather than cause trouble. The black man spoke first. "You, Ezekiel Freeman?" "I am." "My name's Robert Smalls. These are John and William." He gestured to his companions. "We're with the Underground Railroad." Ezekiel set down his plane and faced them directly. "Railroad's dangerous business." "Living's dangerous business," Robert replied. "We heard about you, about your work, about your background." "What about my background?" "That you've got experience making things fail at opportune moments." The words hung in the air, heavy with implication. Ezekiel studied the 3 men carefully. Robert was young, maybe 25, with intelligent eyes and a bearing that suggested he'd never been broken. John and William were older, more cautious, clearly assessing whether this conversation was a mistake. "I'm a carpenter," Ezekiel said carefully. "I build things to last." "Most of the time," Robert agreed, "but we heard about Whitmore Plantation, about a certain carriage accident. Accidents happen. They do, especially to people who've earned them." Robert moved closer, lowering his voice. "We need someone with your skills. Not for building, but for sabotage. Strategic, careful sabotage that looks like natural failure." "Why?" "Because the railroad needs more than safe houses and brave conductors. We need infrastructure disruption. We need bridges that collapse after runaways cross, but before pursuers can follow. We need weapons that misfire when patrols try to use them. We need systems that fail when we need them to fail." Ezekiel was quiet for a long time. Finally, he said, "That's not carpentry, that's war. War's coming whether we want it or not. You read the newspapers. You see how the country's splitting apart. When war comes, you want to be someone who helped slaves escape, or someone who just built pretty chapels and hoped for the best? Those aren't the only options, maybe not, but they're the options available to someone with your particular skills and history. Robert paused. I'm not asking you to kill anyone. I'm asking you to use your knowledge to create opportunities for people to save themselves, just like you saved yourself when you walked away from Whitmore Plantation. I didn't save myself. I destroyed someone else. You did both. That's what makes you valuable. Ezekiel returned to his work, hands moving automatically across wood while his mind processed the request. Finally, without looking up, he said, "What exactly are you asking me to do?" Robert smiled. "There's a plantation in southern Georgia, owner named Marcus Holloway. He's notorious for brutality, for hunting down runaways, for making examples of people who resist. He's got tracking dogs, armed patrols, relationships with every sheriff in 3 counties. And he's building a new slave jail, brick and iron, designed to hold people before auction or punishment. He hired a construction crew from Savannah. We've got people who can get you hired as a consultant. Master Carpenter checking their work, making sure everything's sound. You want me to make sure it's not sound. I want you to make sure that when 50 slaves decide to burn it down and escape during the chaos, the structure fails in ways that prevent pursuit and create maximum confusion." Ezekiel stopped working. He turned to face Robert directly. "How many people will die?" "Fewer than if we do nothing. Holloway's planning to expand his operation. Build 3 more jails, create a regional detention system. We stop him now, we save hundreds. Or we create a massacre. These things are unpredictable. Everything's unpredictable, but doing nothing is also a choice, and people die from that choice every day." The conversation continued for 2 hours. Robert laid out the plan in detail. Timeline, logistics, backup options, escape routes. John and William provided information about Holloway's property, his security, his patterns. They'd done reconnaissance. They had inside contacts. This wasn't improvisation. It was strategy. Finally, Ezekiel asked, "Why me? There are other carpenters, other people with construction knowledge." "Because you understand the stakes in your bones," Robert replied simply. "You've lost someone to this system. You've made it pay, and you've lived with that choice for years. We need someone who won't hesitate or second-guess when it matters." "What if I don't want to do it?" "Then we thank you for your time and never bother you again. But we're asking because we think you're someone who understands that building a better world sometimes requires tearing down the structures of the old one." Ezekiel sent them away with promises to consider the proposal. That night, he sat in his chapel, empty except for moonlight through windows he'd designed to face east, toward sunrise, toward the possibility of new days. He thought about Naomi, about the sound of the whip, about Master Thomas crushed beneath his own arrogance, about Clara from the settlement, her crooked wooden bird, and her belief that people should fly away from danger, about the school in Columbia, children learning to read, building foundations for futures that might include freedom. He thought about Robert's words, "War's coming whether we want it or not." And he thought about his hands, what they'd built, what they'd destroyed, what they might yet do. 3 days later, he rode to the address Robert had provided. He found the 3 men waiting, hopeful but prepared for rejection. "I'll do it," Ezekiel said, "but on one condition." "What's that?" "No one dies. We engineer failure, not massacre. The structure collapses. We create chaos and opportunity, but we don't build death traps. I won't be responsible for crushing people, even people who maybe deserve it." Robert considered this. "Can't guarantee that. Things go wrong in ways we can't predict." "I know, but our intention matters. We design for liberation, not vengeance. You agree to that? I'll help. Otherwise, find someone else." After a moment, Robert extended his hand. "Agreed." They shook, black hands clasping across a divide between revenge and justice, between personal satisfaction and collective liberation. between the man Ezekiel had been and the man he was becoming. The Holloway Plantation job took 6 months to plan and 3 weeks to execute. Ezekiel integrated himself into the construction crew, his expertise and age making him a natural consultant. He examined foundation work, tested brick quality, reviewed ironwork, suggested modifications. Some of his suggestions strengthened the structure. Others introduced subtle weaknesses invisible to inspection but catastrophic under specific stress. He talked with enslaved workers on the property, learning their names, their families, their hopes. He identified potential leaders for the eventual uprising. He mapped escape routes. He became, without advertising it, a conductor on the railroad running through enemy territory. And late at night, in the quarters where he stayed with the construction crew, he wrote letters. To communities he'd helped, to people who taught him to read, to the scattered network of resistors who understood that freedom required more than patience. He wrote, "We are not waiting anymore. We are building our liberation with the same hands they tried to use for their profit. We are becoming the architects of their collapse and the carpenters of our future." He never signed these letters, but people knew who'd written them. And across Georgia and the Carolinas, in churches and schools and settlement halls, those letters were read aloud to people who couldn't read themselves, becoming a kind of scripture for resistance. The night before the planned uprising, Ezekiel walked the perimeter of the new jail. It stood 3 stories tall, brick walls thick enough to stop bullets, iron doors that looked impenetrable. To anyone else, it appeared solid and permanent. But Ezekiel saw the weaknesses he'd engineered. The foundation columns slightly off-center, compensating now but ready to fail under lateral stress. The mortar mixed with too much sand in specific locations, strong enough to pass inspection, but compromised enough to crumble under fire. The iron bars anchored in ways that appeared secure, but would pull free given proper leverage. It was, in its way, his masterpiece. Not because it was beautiful, but because it perfectly balanced appearance and reality, solidity and fragility, security and vulnerability. Like slavery itself, a system that appeared permanent but was actually held together by force and fear and the active cooperation of people who could choose, at any moment, to stop cooperating. The next evening, 50 slaves rose up. They set fires simultaneously in 3 locations. They overpowered guards. They opened cells. And as Ezekiel had promised, the jail's structure began to fail in ways that prevented effective response. Doors jamming, walls cracking, escape routes opening while pursuit routes collapsed. It wasn't perfect. 2 people died in the chaos. 1 overseer who resisted violently, 1 elderly slave who suffered a heart attack. But 48 people walked away from Holloway Plantation that night, disappearing into networks that would move them north, towards states where their humanity might eventually be recognized in law as well as fact. Ezekiel left before dawn. His work completed, his purpose served. He rode toward the Carolinas, feeling neither satisfaction nor guilt, just the empty exhaustion of someone who'd spent reserves they'd barely known they possessed. He wondered if this was what Naomi would have wanted. If she'd approve of how he'd transformed grief into strategy, personal pain into collective action. He'd never know, but he chose to believe she'd understand that love sometimes meant building things for others rather than monuments to the beloved. As he crossed into South Carolina, the sun rose behind him, gilding Georgia's trees with light that made everything look redeemed. He knew it was illusion. The state remained slave territory. The system remained intact. But individual humans had escaped. Individual structures had collapsed, and enough individual acts of resistance, accumulated across time, could build something that resembled justice. The decade that followed was the country's descent into war. Arguments became fights, fights became battles, battles became systematic slaughter. By 1861, the nation had split in 2, and the thing everyone pretended wouldn't happen was happening. a war to determine whether a country founded on liberty could survive half slave and half free. Ezekiel was 62 when Fort Sumter fell, too old for combat, but not too old for contribution. Throughout the war years, he continued his work with the Underground Railroad, now operating more openly under the protection of Union advancement. He built safe houses, repaired wagons that carried refugees, designed hiding places in structures throughout the border states. He also began training others in his specific skills. Young men, both black and white, who understood that construction knowledge could become resistance strategy. He taught them how to read structural weaknesses, how to introduce failure points, how to create strategic collapses. He became, in effect, a teacher of sabotage disguised as carpentry. The Union Army occasionally consulted him on engineering projects, how to build bridges quickly, how to destroy them effectively, how to construct fortifications that would withstand assault, how to weaken Confederate infrastructure without obvious violence. He gave his knowledge freely, understanding that anything that shortened the war saved lives. By 1863, after the Emancipation Proclamation, he began receiving visits from formerly enslaved people who'd heard stories about the carpenter who rebuilt the master's carriage. They came seeking confirmation, wanting to know if the legends were true. Ezekiel never confirmed or denied anything specific, but he'd tell them about Naomi, about the 30 lashes, about the choice between acceptance and resistance, about understanding that some structures needed to collapse so better ones could be built. They'd leave understanding more than they'd come knowing. One visitor stood out, a young woman named Ruth, maybe 23, who'd escaped from a plantation just outside Fairfield, Georgia. She came to his workshop in 1864, nervous but determined. "I knew your wife," she said simply. Ezekiel looked up from the chair he was building, his hands stilling. "Naomi?" "Yes. I was just a child, but I remember her. She was kind to me when I was scared. She told me stories about Africa, about kingdoms and kings and people who'd never been slaves. She made me believe there was something beyond the plantation." "She was good at that," Ezekiel replied quietly. "Making people believe in possibilities. They said you killed Master Whitmore, that you built his carriage to collapse and crush him. Is it true? What do you believe?" Ruth considered this carefully. "I believe justice exists. I believe God uses human hands to deliver it. I believe my freedom is built on the foundation of people who refuse to accept their bondage." She paused. "And I believe Naomi would be proud of everything you've done since she died." "How do you know what I've done?" "Everyone knows. The schools, the railroad work, the structures that somehow fail at exactly the right moments. You're famous in ways white people don't recognize because they're not paying attention to our stories. Fame is dangerous. So is invisibility. At least fame means you're remembered." Ezekiel invited her to stay for dinner. They talked late into the night, about Whitmore Plantation, about changes the war was bringing, about whether freedom granted by legal document would ever match freedom claimed through resistance. Ruth was brilliant and fierce, her mind sharp from self-taught literacy, and her spirit unbroken by years in bondage. Before she left, she asked, "What happens now, after the war? When slavery ends legally, what becomes of people like us?" "We build," Ezekiel replied. "Same as we've always done, but this time we build for ourselves, not for masters. We build schools and churches and communities. We build political power and economic independence. We build lives that can't be collapsed by other people's violence. And if they try to stop us, then we build better than they destroy. We've been doing it for centuries. We'll keep doing it." Ruth smiled. "You really believe that?" "I've spent my whole life building things. Some lasted, some failed. But the act of building, that's what matters. Not what we make, but that we refuse to stop making it." The war ended in 1865. The Confederacy collapsed, not just militarily, but structurally. An entire economy and social order built on slavery, discovering that foundations constructed from human suffering couldn't bear the weight of scrutiny and resistance. Ezekiel was 66. His hands trembled slightly now, arthritis making fine work difficult, but he continued building, his projects smaller but no less meaningful. He built a school in Columbia that still stands today. He built a church in Charleston that became a center for political organizing during Reconstruction. He built homes for freedmen who had nowhere to go, teaching them carpentry so they could build their own futures. In 1868, he received a letter. The handwriting was shaky but clear. "Dear Mr. Freeman, my name is Constance Whitmore. You may not remember me, but I remember you. You built beautiful things for my family before everything collapsed. I'm writing because I've recently completed the process of transferring all former Whitmore Plantation land to the freedmen who worked it. This includes the quarters, the fields, and the workshop where you used to labor. I wanted you to know that your cabin has been preserved. The workshop remains standing. I've established a school there, open to all children regardless of race. We call it the Naomi Freeman School. I know you have questions about my father's death. I've lived with those questions for 26 years. I've concluded that whatever happened was a kind of justice I couldn't have delivered myself. I hope you've found peace. I hope the world we're building now is one both you and Naomi would recognize as worth the suffering it required. If you ever wish to return, you are welcome, not as property, but as family. With respect and gratitude, Constance Whitmore Campbell Ezekiel read the letter 3 times. Then he folded it carefully and placed it in a wooden box where he kept Naomi's few possessions, a headscarf, a carved spoon, a lock of her hair. He never went back to Georgia. The place contained too much pain, too much memory. But he sent Constance a letter in return, thanking her for the school, expressing hope for the future, and explaining that while he couldn't return to Georgia, Georgia had made him who he became. "We are shaped by what we endure," he wrote, "but we are defined by how we respond to that endurance. I responded by building, not just structures, but possibilities, not just revenge, but justice. Not just one man's escape, but contributions toward collective liberation. The Carriage collapsed because it was built to collapse. The system of slavery collapsed because it was built to collapse. And from those collapses, we build something better. That's the work. That's always been the work." He died in 1872 in the house he'd built, surrounded by people he'd taught and helped and liberated. 73 years old, body worn from labor, but spirit unbroken. His funeral was attended by hundreds, former slaves who'd used the Underground Railroad, children from schools he'd built, carpenters he'd trained, abolitionists he'd worked alongside. They buried him in Columbia's Freedmen's Cemetery, his grave marked with a simple wooden cross carved with his chosen name, Ezekiel Freeman, and beneath that, 3 words that summarized his philosophy: builder, liberator, witness. Years later, historians would piece together his story from letters and oral histories and gaps in official records. They'd debate whether the story of Thomas Whitmore's Carriage was fact or legend. They'd question whether individual acts of resistance really mattered against systemic violence. They'd argue about the ethics of strategic sabotage versus peaceful resistance. But in communities across the South, especially in the churches and schools and homes he'd built, the story persisted with the clarity of gospel. Once there was a carpenter who built beautiful things for cruel people. Then he lost the woman he loved to that cruelty. And instead of accepting or surrendering or simply escaping, he used his gifts to ensure that cruelty collapsed under its own weight. They called it an accident. The enslaved called it divine carpentry. The freed called it justice delayed, but finally delivered. And Ezekiel Freeman, wherever his spirit rested, might have smiled at the irony. that the hands Master Thomas Whitmore once owned had built structures that would outlast his memory, that the man he considered property had authored his ending, and that freedom, when it finally came, was built as much by strategic collapse as by gradual construction. In the chapel Ezekiel built, still standing in Colombia, there's a wooden beam above the entrance, carved with words he added in his final years. We build what the future deserves, not what the past demanded. We are architects of liberation, carpenters of justice, and the structures we create will stand long after the systems that oppressed us have collapsed into memory. Visitors still come to read those words, still place their hands on wood shaped by Ezekiel's hands more than a century ago. Still understand that resistance takes many forms, that liberation requires both vision and precision, and that sometimes the most radical act is simply refusing to build the world as others demand it, and insisting on constructing something better. The master's carriage collapsed on a Sunday morning in 1842, but Ezekiel Freeman's legacy, built carefully, precisely, lovingly, stands still.